Hi students. Today we're going to be starting a new unit, and the unit's going to be about resource availability and the distribution in our world. Today we are starting with the first two learning targets, LT1, which talks about how we as humans rely on the four spheres of the earth and the impact that overpopulation and overconsumption have on the four spheres. And the second learning target talks about renewable resources and non-renewable resources. So here we go, let's get started. You guys have learned from the last unit that the Earth has four spheres. We have the biosphere, the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and the geosphere or lithosphere. And you learned that these four spheres are constantly interacting with each other via the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and just by, the biosphere relying on all of the rest of the spheres. Now, because these four spheres are constantly interacting, the Earth is always changing. And here's some pictures that show some examples of how Earth changes. We have, climate change, we have pollution, we have, the Earth is constantly changing. And because of that, organisms have to adapt to these changes if they want to survive. Now let's talk about how humans have adapted to the constant changes in the Earth. So we have learned to adapt to these changes by using what we call natural resources. Here are some pictures of natural resources. Basically, it's any natural substance, organism, or energy form that living things can use. For us, I put these two pictures here because it kind of shows you how humans have taken these things from nature and rebuilt them into products that make our lives more comfortable and convenient, such as making shoes, making shoe boxes, and making disposable Starbucks cups. And we're going to talk about um, these things and how they relate to pollution later in the unit. It's very important we keep those things in mind. Okay, so there's two types of natural resources. The first type is renewable resource. So renewable, notice how there's the word which means to repeat or to go over again, newable. So basically renewable resources are resources that can be used and replaced over a very short period of time. So these are some examples of renewable resources. Obviously, deforestation and chopping down lots of trees is not very good for the environment. However, we can plant more trees and help them regrow. Sunlight is a constant renewable resource. Wind is always going to be there. Same with crops and even fishing. There's some fish farms that are trying to make sure that we're not taking away too much of fish in the actual ocean ecosystem so that we keep the ecosystems balanced. Okay, the second type is non-renewable resources. So non means not renewable. So that means that these resources, they might be able to be replaced, but it's going to take thousands and thousands of years or even millions of years, or they can't even be replaced. These are some examples of non-renewable resources. So coal, natural gas, gasoline, these are all fossil fuels. We're going to talk more about fossil fuels in the next lesson and how they are formed, but obviously they're made from fossils, which take millions of years to make. So once we use them up, it's going to be really hard to replace. This is a picture of nuclear power. Nuclear power uses element uranium to make power, and those things are also very difficult to replace. And iron ore, a lot of the metals are a real more difficult to replace once we use them in products. So it's very important that we recycle them or reuse them. Okay, so now let's kind of get into the bigger picture of these natural resources. So countries are able to get natural resources for their own use, and different countries have different kinds of natural resources, and countries are constantly trading amongst each other to get different resources for their citizens. The ability of a country to get resources depends on three things. First, the supply. So how much of that natural resources is actually available. Then we have the price, and the price really depends on how much of that resource is available and how easy it is to, find and extract. And the third one is politics. So some nations have more power and money to get more resources and others might not. Some nations, and this is a graph that kind of shows you where natural gas comes from. Russia has the most natural gas, whereas, and also some Middle Eastern countries have a lot of these fossil fuels. So these nations that have these natural resources on their land, they control the price of the resources and they can sell them to other countries for their use. Now, in the world today, natural resources are spread pretty unequally among the countries. So, the more economically developed countries, that means the countries that have booming economies, that have a lot more money, they use most of the resources around the world, while less economically developed countries use fewer resources. And this is actually a graph that came from the World Bank that shows you how much energy per capita. Per capita is a word that means per person. So per citizen of that country, how much energy does each person use? And you can see the top energy use country is actually the United States. So each citizen in the United States uses more energy, meaning the more kilograms of oil per person than all of these countries that are down here. Um, and this is in thousands of kilograms of oil. So it's very interesting to see that the US since 1960 has kind of had a constant use of a lot of oil compared to these other countries. Um, so people in more economically developed countries need lots of resources to sustain what we call high levels of consumption. And what that means is, for example, developed countries, sorry, they sell lots of products that have packaged materials that are come actually from natural resources. So, for example, water bottles are made from a fossil fuel because plastic is actually made from fossil fuels, and not only are they individually packaged, they sell it to you in that package and they have the water inside. Whereas people in less economically developed countries have natural resources, but they might not have as much access. Their country might not have as much access. So a lot of times they um, have different ways to get what they need. So here in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Africa, they use water pumps to get their water, as opposed to in the developed countries, we buy bottles of water. So right now there's a shift. So what happens is the people in less economically developed countries have natural resources to sell to other nations with more money. So as those countries gain more money from selling these natural resources, these countries are getting more and more developed. So people who live in those countries are getting a better standard of living. And with that comes an increased demand for more and more natural resources. So more and more people around the world want to live kind of like the American lifestyle where it's very developed. But the greater the number of people that that are trying to push for that American style of living, the more resources are used and the more quickly they're going to be depleted over time. So let's look at who uses the most natural resources in the world. These are three graphs from this, or three tables from the CIA World Factbook, and it compares which countries use the most petroleum, natural gas, and crude oil. And it's not surprising that the United States actually uses the most out of any country in the world. And I want you to imagine what would happen if every single country in the world started to use as much oil and resources as the United States does. Okay, so now let's talk about what natural resources have to do with the human population size. So last year we started talking about the idea of carrying capacity and limiting factors and um, the amount of resources available to a population and an ecosystem. And we didn't really get to dive into the human aspect of that. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Every 20 minutes, around 3,500 people are added to the world. And people today use 5 times more resources than they did in 1970. So that's a big problem because the more people there are, the more resources each person needs. And it brings up the question, like, what are we going to do to address the fact that there are limited resources on the earth? And if the population keeps growing, how are we going to distribute those resources so that those people will be able to live um, a better life? And this graphic shows, you know, how much of the world has been growing in developing countries versus developed countries. You can see most of the population growth is happening in the developing countries. The developed countries have stabilized. Um, and this graphic kind of shows you how much land and food production we would need to make to comfortably feed the number of people that is here on Earth. So you can see as the population increases, we need more and more land, water, resources to feed that entire population. And the problem is there might not be enough land or water or resources available to feed that many people. So now let's talk about conservation. So here's the problem. Humans have been using more resources more quickly than they can be replaced. So even if something's renewable, like trees or air or water, because there's so many more people using them at the same time, it's really difficult to replace them quickly. And as economies grow, and as demands for products grow, and as the population grows, we're going to need more and more resources from the environment. And the question is, are we going to be living in a world that looks like this if we don't conserve our resources and think about ways that we can use resources in a better way to prevent these things, because we know from observation and from scientific studies that if you continue to remove certain resources without replacement, it causes major imbalances in ecosystems. And we talked about the food web, we talked about the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, and all of those things really affect everyone, all the living things and us. So we really need to think about the consequences of our actions. And this graphic kind of ties together, environment, our consumption, pollution, and all the things that we decide to do, and all the decisions that we make, and how it affects the rest of the world. Okay, so finally, let's talk about the idea of sustainable use. So you may have seen these words on posters outside, maybe on billboards, or maybe you haven't seen them. But it's becoming a more and more common term. And basically, it's the idea that we use renewable resources in ways that meets the needs of the present while also conserving resources for the future. And I found this really nice quote. It says, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." So basically, it's saying we need to use the earth in a way that it's going to be preserved for the future, because we don't want to see it being destroyed. We don't want to have to rely on another planet like Mars to, sustain our lifestyles. And finally, let's start the conversation. Obviously, this is a really huge topic, how we can conserve natural resources through sustainable practices. There's going to be a whole nother lesson and unit about this, but it doesn't hurt to start thinking about it. But, what can we do to kind of preserve our Earth? What are some simple things that people can do in their everyday life? So obviously, reduce, reuse, and recycle, the 3 R's, really big deal. And only using resources when necessary. Do we really need extra napkins? Do we really need to, throw away certain, pencils and paper? I can just talk about, at school, are you throwing away things that you shouldn't be, or are you using things when you don't really need it? So think about those things. Those small actions make a really big difference in the rest of the world. And we're going to be exploring this idea a lot more later. So stay tuned. And that's it.